Okay. Now we take PowerPoint 2 and we continue on slide 7. Uh, I won't ask you to remember all these newspapers, but I will tell you as I go along which ones I do want you to remember. There was something called the Boston Newsletter that began in 1704, so we're in the early colonial days. John Campbell was the publisher. He published it with royal permission. This is a point you do need to know that in the colonial days, anyone who wanted to publish a newspaper had to get permission from the British government because remember, the colonial people were ruled by King George, and he had to approve whatever you wanted to publish. So they published bland, safe stories. It was poorly received by the public. People didn't want that, as you can tell by the early dime novels that came out. James Franklin, who was Benjamin Franklin's brother, published the New England Courant. He pioneered this idea of they didn't need official approval. Why in the world should they need official approval? He was jailed for publishing without prior authority, and he then appointed his brother Ben to take over, and the paper thrived. But they were serious about it. The British government was serious, and if you can think ahead, that was one of the things that we didn't want. And in our Constitution, we made a way for people to have freedom of the press, which meant they could publish what they wanted to without getting any kind of prior approval from the government. Go on to 8. Benjamin Franklin published the Pennsylvania Gazette, and he did some interesting new things. Of course, Ben Franklin was a genius in many ways. He was an innovator. He had great ideas. He was an inventor. He discovered things. He was just had a great mind. He proved that advertising can sell merchandise. Now, that without advertising, we know that a lot of our newspapers would have folded by now. But advertising is expensive, and the newspapers have to balance what are they giving people for the advertising dollars. He showed that journalism can be an honorable profession. He debuted the idea of editorial cartoons. I really adore editorial cartoons. I think editorial cartoonists are brilliant. They manage to get across to people a very important idea or opinion in just one cell. In other words, one box. And every morning they wake up and they face a blank piece of paper, and they're able to fill it with illustrations in very few words to create something that speaks politically in very few words. Franklin greatly improved the readability of newspapers. He used easier to read fonts. He used headlines. That was a new thing. Cleaner, simpler layout designs. As we move to 9, in the early days, few newspapers existed. Most publishers were printers or postmasters, and Franklin was both. News was not very timely. Colonial authority did not support a free press. When we say news was not very timely, first of all, there had to be somebody to go out and get the news. Somebody with a nose for news had to go out, collect information that their readers would want to read. Then they had to write stories about the news. And it was a long process, and it was expensive. So it was hard to stay in business. And on 10, slide 10, the United States came into being with the Declaration of Independence that was approved on July 4th, 1776. And the Declaration published en masse, which means for everyone in mass quantities, and distributed throughout the land. And the First Amendment gave us the right of freedom of the press. The Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, and the First Amendment of those gave us freedom of the press. And the newspapers began to grow rapidly. Now you didn't have to get permission from the government, but they were expensive. They were 6 cents and still targeted to the affluent merchant class, which, as I said, they're able to read it and know what's going on because they have the money to afford it. Moving along to slide 11, we have in 1833 a publisher named Benjamin Day who wanted, of course, everyone to read his newspaper. And I'm publishing a book in the next few months, and I would like everybody to read my book. So I have to figure out some clever ways to get the news out. Well, Benjamin Day published the New York Sun and offered issues for a penny. This was something quite new, and it started a whole new way of doing things in publications. In 1897, Dr. Philip O'Hanlon, a New York coroner's assistant, was asked by his 8-year-old daughter, Virginia, if Santa Claus really existed. Dr. O'Hanlon told Virginia to direct her question to the New York Sun. Oh, there you go. Write to them. Somebody there will have the answer. He said, if you see it in the Sun, it's so. That's how much they believed the newspaper. There was no such thing as fake news then. Everybody trusted and believed in the newspaper. The newspaper ran an editorial called Yes, Virginia, There Is a Santa Claus, which was very moving to the many who read it. And more than a century later, if we go to the end of the 1900s, it remains the most printed editorial ever to run in any newspaper in the English language. So I will probably ask you which is what is the story behind the most read or most printed editorial ever in the United States. So we're on slide 12, again, about the early days of the newspaper. So when Benjamin Day started selling his newspapers for a penny, that brought about the saying penny press. They called it the penny press, and circulation grew to 30,000 in the first 3 years. Other pioneers of the penny press were James Gordon Bennett. You don't need to remember his name, but I would like you to remember Horace Greeley, very famous man who published the New York Morning Post. Greeley is known for a slogan. He would say, "Go west, young man," because in those days we had not really moved in and populated the West. So Greeley later published the New York Tribune, and his impact on American life was great, but nowhere could it be seen more than in the western migration of America. He was urging people to go west and settle. Slide 13. So what was his contribution? At the age of 22, he started this penny press. His contribution was that he lowered the price of a newspaper from 6 cents to 1 penny, and his content was focused on sex, crime, and human interest, all those things that human beings want to read about. Then there is James Gordon Bennett, which I don't need you to memorize, but he founded the New York Herald. He introduced financial and sports pages. So add those to sex, crime, and human interest, financial and sports pages. And in slide 14, we talk about Horace Greeley a bit. He started his New York Tribune in 1841, and he wrote appeals to the reader intellect rather than emotions. He decided to read for those great minds who could take in the news and do something with it. And he had news and editorials centered on crusades and causes. The New York Times was established 10 years after that, founded by Henry Raymond, and it introduced objective and reasoned journalism. In other words, if you were going to write an opinion, it would have to be labeled as opinion because the rest of the news was objective. They wrote the truth. And on 15, this is what you needed for a mass newspaper. You needed a quick, cost-efficient printing process. So, so you had people working on the printing press. They weren't satisfied just leaving it the way it was first invented. They had to keep modifying it so that it would work better, that it could print faster. And then they also needed a critical mass of literate customers. If you're publishing something that needs to be read, you need readers who can read it.